And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. By 2019, El Salvador was in decline. Low economic growth, high levels of violence, underpinned by a history of US imperialism plundering the designated Coffee Republic. With the backing of the US, the military coup sparked a civil war which displaced more than 1 million people, many of whom came to the US. Ronald Reagan's explicit policy in El Salvador was to build an anti-communist army and use that to justify ignoring the very overt crimes against humanity that were overwhelmingly perpetrated by the military junta. There's a whole history about how this destabilization was the genesis for gangs like MS-13, who today have been blamed for El Salvador's relatively high crime rate. After the civil war and democratization in El Salvador, within the forces and authorities charged with leading state institutions, interests and powers persist that have found it more beneficial to operate by the old system of unwritten, undemocratic rules of the game than to cultivate respect for and adherence to the rule of law. Overwhelmingly, elites were represented in the peacemaking process and, consequently, the government, and were the beneficiaries of El Salvador's neoliberalization period, whereby the conservative government began to sell off large tracts of public assets, pursue dollarization, and deregulation. To use one example out of many, the administration used government resources to clean up the banks, to sell them, and then purchase them themselves. They literally became bank holders for free. Satisfaction with democracy was dropping, voter participation was dropping, and politics became synonymous with corruption. People felt disenfranchised, and it was in this context people turned to a new idea. In 2020, President Nayib Bukele instructed 40 soldiers to occupy the El Salvadoran parliament in order to coerce members to ratify a $109 million loan from the US. This loan was from a bank known as the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, financed by the US and dubbed the Dictator's Bank for its opaque and dodgy arrangements with Latin American autocrats. This marked the cascade of autocratization we've seen in El Salvador for the past few years. In his bid to maintain a strong mandate, Bukele has completely gerrymandered the electorate to his party's benefit, reducing the amount of seats in the Legislative Assembly from 84 to 60, increasing Bukele's share from 66% to 83%. Bukele has dismissed the Supreme Court and as Attorney General sought to regulate social media and enforce a culture of silence in the public service through intimidation, surveillance, and threats, which has significantly curtailed journalists' ability to report on what's going on. The government no longer publishes official records, they block access to information by designating it as reserved, such as homicide statistics, declaring it non-existent, or simply ignoring freedom of information requests. The 2022 state of emergency declared by Bukele suspended constitutional rights and eliminated legal oversight of public fund use, state contracts, and the right to access public information. Since Bukele has used the pretext of cracking down on crime to lock up potential political opponents, 400 or half of El Salvador's unions have been deregistered by Bukele, and over 16 trade unionists have been locked up, one reportedly dying in custody. Numerous human rights and land rights activists like Fidel Zavala have been detained or imprisoned arbitrarily and reportedly tortured. On the 23rd of June 2003, President Francisco Flores launched Mano Dura from one of the capital's gang-controlled neighborhoods. Positioned in front of a wall covered with oversized graffiti, he informed the assembled journalists that gang members would be systematically arrested and order thus re-established in affected communities. Since the police have publicly attributed the majority of homicides to these groups, the implication was that the plan would not only dismantle the gangs, but also lower the country's high level of crime. In the following months, amid considerable media publicity, the authorities embarked on graffiti removal, joint police/military anti-gang squads could be seen patrolling the streets, and police carried out massive area sweeps to detain suspected gang members. The young men and women seized in these operations were often publicly exhibited to the press, which played a critical role in framing Mano Dura as an effective policy by supplying abundant coverage of these spectacular crackdowns. History clearly rhymes. 20 years before Bukele's crackdown, the right-wing Arena government underwent a very similar one, dubbed La Mano Dura. A flailing economy, high crime rate, high public dissatisfaction with politics, the same story. Unlike Bukele's recent stint though, we have the benefit of hindsight to see what these similarly tough on crime or anti-gang policies actually did. Interestingly, while crime did fall for a few years during La Mano Dura and later an intensified Super Mano Dura, it actually later picked up again in El Salvador to levels beyond pre-Mano Dura. This was for three reasons. Number one, it didn't address the underpinnings of crime, what motivates people to join gangs and commit crimes. That being social deprivation from a lack of education and support systems, making it so people have to rely on gangs since they're the only ones offering that kind of necessary infrastructure. Number two, imprisoning en masse these gangs actually solidified the basis for these gangs. Basically, someone is much more likely to be a repeat offender, basic criminology concept of recidivism. And particularly when you're sent to a prison and all you're surrounded with is gangs and that kind of lifestyle, it's pretty obvious where that can lead some people. Number three, driving the gangs underground made them more sophisticated and organized and began using prisons themselves as hubs for recruitment and training. Based on historical precedent, Bukele's policies will likely lead to something similar, a later uptick in crime, and if I had to guess, we're living in that kind of initial lull period given it's been about 3 years since the state of emergency has been declared. Though, again, we don't actually know. As mentioned, the homicide registry was stripped from the public record by Bukele. But the basis for a future problem is already showing. Poverty in El Salvador is growing, nearly half the population are not eating enough on a daily basis, and there have been large cuts to social services, education, and healthcare, again, infrastructure that is otherwise provided by gangs, if not by the state. Conversely, spending on security or the military has rapidly increased, and you've also got these weird dictator projects which have flunked like Bitcoin City. What's interesting is that this policy hasn't always been Bukele's strategy. Leaks from the government have revealed that in 2019 and 2020, Bukele actually sat at the table with leading gangs in El Salvador to broker some kind of peace and to secure electoral support. It was these deals which may have been responsible for lowering El Salvador's crime rates and not so much Bukele's outwardly initial tough on crime approach. It was only a breakdown in these relations between the government and a few of these gangs which provoked the spike in homicides, which was then used as pretext for the crackdown. Bukele's history of dealing with gangs goes back further, as detailed by a recently freed high-ranking Barrio 18 member. Back when Bukele was mayor, he used his contacts in local gangs as a means to ascend political relevancy. I think this kind of behavior makes it very clear that Bukele isn't some kind of crusader for the poor and downtrodden in the face of gang violence, but rather an aspiring autocrat who was calculated enough to rise up the ranks and broker deals here and there. But now that he's in power, well, you've got his vanity projects and dreams of being a Western tourist dumping ground, whilst his people are increasingly impoverished, laying the basis for a future crime wave or societal rupture. Political opponents done away with, public records no longer available. He's not afraid to use the military to flex the power of the executive, to stack the legislature, and to rebuke the judiciary. But outside of analysing Bukele personally, his ascendancy is reflective of a broader trend we've seen regionally and globally, the consequences of neoliberal capitalism. That being isolation, atomization, insecurity, making people feel like they've got no stake or say in society, economic growth being divorced from the actual feeling that you're living a good life. That then causes disillusionment, disenchantment from the current system, moving many towards self-presenting maverick populists, rallying against the establishment that they themselves are a part of. I mean, Bukele is a pretty wealthy guy, he's pretty well connected, he's a part of a nexus of dark money and political elites, getting his start in politics from $3 million that came from a Venezuelan oil company Interval, cloaked as campaign donations when he was mayor of San Salvador, and helped him invest in Starlight, a company that owns TVX television station. During his tenure as mayor, Interval dropped by with 500 grand at his office, and reportedly they no longer pay tax on their real estate in the city. Bukele's security minister, Hector Villatoro, was a connect of known political operative Herbert Sacker. Sacker is basically the guy you go to administer and secure bribes and deals with shadowy underground figures and other political elites. Here is Bukele himself in 2019 sitting at a table with Sacker. It's clear that Bukele is a schemer, and though it wouldn't be fair to characterize him as in the pocket of gangs or whatever, he nonetheless is a part of a web of a certain section of El Salvadoran elites who have captured the political sphere and are throwing their weight around. Nayib Bukele is the manifestation of the material reality that has plagued El Salvadoran society for decades, something exported violently from the imperial metropole in Washington in collaboration with local El Salvadoran elites. And while I think applying Amirs Cesaire's idea of an imperial boomerang to America isn't a perfect fit, I do think that tendencies that us in the West and our liberal high horse viewers, third world or foreign, will be brought back here just as we helped produce it. Trump has already brazenly ignored the courts. They're looking to suspend habeas corpus, and ICE is increasingly being forged into a weapon to target political dissent. The rumblings of martial law are already here. A month ago, vast swaths of land near the southern border were seized and given to the Department of Defense. America, and the West broadly, has been going down steadily towards autocratization, intensifying at what now is a flashpoint in America with the election of Trump, but you can see it across numerous different countries. Through neocolonialism, which has upheld the explosive amount of growth of neoliberal capitalism seen in the global north, we have seen violence perpetrated at the behest of maintaining stable commodity production. Raw resources and low-wage labor is extracted from the developing world to the overwhelming benefit to us in the developed world. And this dynamic, which, when interrupted, has been violently put down by local elites and their friends in Washington or London, Paris, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow. This history of exporting violence and misery to the imperial periphery has crept up on us in the metropole. Neoliberalism upheld by the global south has, despite nominally raising living standards, left many feeling isolated and insecure. Financial crashes caused by speculators essentially gambling away the economy has left us in a state of polycrisis. But far from being intimidated by crisis, capital nowadays is working really hard to produce and experience it. And it is from this crisis that new, aspiring, rebellious, and a loud section of the ruling elite solidifies popular support for their power. And we're too atomized, too caught up in the post-truth whirlwind that is politics now to stop it.